So let me begin by saying that I entirely appreciate why so many venerate and idolise Jordan Peterson, as he's obviously an intelligent and insightful man whose defence of free speech and biological facts has been truly admirable. In fact, it's precisely for these reasons that he has my respect. However, unlike many of his critics, who caveat their criticisms by first making clear that they're very fond of the man, I won't, because I'm not. To be blunt, while I recognise Peterson's intellect and charisma, I'm convinced that he's one of the most overrated public intellectuals of our time, and that this is especially the case when it comes to his views on religion. In fact, I will go so far as to say that Jordan Peterson is the Deepak Chopra of Christianity, and within the following few videos I intend to explain precisely why. Of course, I prefer to address all of his religious views in just one video, but given my current situation I unfortunately can't justify doing this. But, as just indicated, what I can justify is creating a series of videos which each address a pillar of his beliefs, and then later compile them all together. And so, with that said, where better to begin than with Epistemology 101? This is Jordan Peterson's Truth, Debunked. On the 9th of November 2015, in an interview with Transliminal, Peterson had the following to say on the topic of truth.
So now then you ask yourself, well, how do you determine whether or not a theory is true? Then you ask yourself, well, what do you mean by true? Well, then you're in trouble. Okay, because I think you can take a Newtonian perspective on that, or a Darwinian perspective, but you can't do both at the same time.
Okay, so I'm going to interject quite a lot within this video, but it's only to simplify and adequately address what's being said. So far, Peterson has claimed that there's two perspectives on truth. The first is what he calls Newtonian, which he later defines as strictly materialistic.
Truth as defined by the axioms of the materialist philosophy.
And the second is what he calls Darwinian, which he later defines as that which permits survival.
Sufficient truth is the truth that allows you to survive and reproduce. And from a Darwinian perspective, there isn't any truth past that.
But there's immediately several problems here, and not the least of which is that he's committing a black and white fallacy. He's falsely asserting that there's only two perspectives of truth, when in fact there's many more, including the most subscribed to, which is realism. Realists, like me, and probably you, hold that reality exists with or without our viewing it. That is, that a falling tree makes a sound with or without our being there to hear it. But we don't assert that reality is strictly materialistic. And a second problem that's worth emphasising at this point is that while Peterson's definition of truth can be seen as Darwinian, it does not represent Darwin's view. And so when Peterson says or implies that it does,
and that's basically Darwin's claim,
know that he's putting words never spoken into Darwin's mouth. Anyhow, here's Peterson fleshing out his perspective of truth, which, courtesy of Brett Weinstein, is now known as metaphorical truth.
So Nietzsche said truth serves life. Okay, in some sense that's a Darwinian idea, okay? If it's true enough so that if you act it out or hold it, that increases your chances of survival and reproduction over long spans of time, that's true.
And here's him putting it more clearly to Sam Harris while on Harris's podcast.
The fundamental axiom that I'm playing with is something that was basically expressed by Nietzsche, and it's a definition of truth. And so I would say, if it doesn't serve life, it's not true.
Now, while this definition is needlessly confusing, it's not inherently flawed. If Peterson and his ilk want to call that which serves life, or that which increases human flourishing, true, then that's fine. Again, it's confusing because it means, for example, that if the fact that atoms store potential energy should one day prove fatal to us, then while this fact will remain true in the colloquial/realist sense of the word, it will all of a sudden become false in the Peterson sense of the word. But what's not fine is to insist, as Peterson does, that should a fact become false according to the Peterson definition of truth, then it will also become false according to the realist definition of truth.
It sounds like what you're saying is that truth is as much about action as it is about some sort of material, measurable, objective reality.
No, I'm saying it's more about action.
More about...
Oh yes, yes. The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action. And then the objective science is nested inside that. It has to be.
Right.
There's no way around that. There's only one way you can define truth in relationship to finite beings. It's true enough. True enough for what? True enough so that you survive and reproduce. That's it. You don't get to go any farther. What's more true than that? Sorry, can't ask that question. That's it. You've hit the limit, and that's basically Darwin's claim.
And to provide just one more example, here's him putting it another way, but this time as a response to an excellent criticism from Weinstein.
So my point was essentially that there is something called metaphorical truth and that it's a real thing. So I'm in agreement with you on that. Where we might be in disagreement is that there is simultaneously a thing that I would call literal truth or scientific truth. And by the way, I'm not saying that what scientists say is in this category inherently. Scientists can be wrong. But the point is truth that is scientifically verifiable, that makes predictions, has a special priority in this hierarchy because it is the one objective version. It is not contingent on being nested in a series of beliefs. So,
what if it's a scientific truth that's metaphorically wrong?
Oh, and there are...
Like, I can give you an example. Okay, so I read the memoirs of a KGB scientist, KGB agent, who worked with the Russians in this biochemical lab, and their job was to meld Ebola with smallpox, because Ebola is not that contagious, and so that's kind of annoying if you're trying to kill people, whereas smallpox, but it's really fatal, whereas smallpox is really contagious, so if you could get the two together and then develop an aerosol spray, you could kill a lot of people. And in fact, they did kill about 500 Russians by mistake when some of what they were doing escaped. But it isn't obvious to me that that's an invalid scientific pursuit. But I do think that it's an invalid ethical pursuit. And so that seems to me to indicate that the ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim.
Now, just before I crack down on Peterson's assertion, and in the anticipation of being accused of not understanding his position, I want to make something extremely clear. I entirely understand and accept that our perception of facts and reality, that is, our perception of realist truth, is subject to natural selection, or metaphorical truth. And so if Peterson's assertion was merely that this fact prevents us from having access to raw realist truth, then I'd have no objection. But he's not merely asserting this, he's asserting that scientific, objective, realist, literal truth is outright the product of metaphorical, Peterson truth.
The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action, and then the objective science is nested inside that.
The ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim.
So, what exactly is wrong with Peterson's assertion? Why doesn't metaphorical truth supersede literal truth? Well, first and foremost,
it doesn't supersede with respect to the truth claim, it supersedes with respect to considerations of behavior and policy.
Secondly, though more importantly, it violates the law of non-contradiction. To borrow an example from Weinstein, the concepts of heaven and reincarnation can both be considered metaphorically true, because they both increase our chances of survival due to them encouraging us to cooperate and behave. But the problem is that they can't both be true, they're mutually exclusive. One claims that when we die, we'll rise up to Cloudsville to be reunited with our loved ones, while the other claims that we'll manifest a new body and start anew. Or as Weinstein puts it,
what I'm arguing is that what makes the scientific truth hierarchically superior is that it explains all the subordinate truths in a way that is logically consistent, whereas if you were to prioritize heaven as a truth, then you would have to say, well, reincarnation is therefore false, or you would have to have them all simultaneously be true in some unreconcilable way. So the only one that has the special characteristic of accounting for all the others is the scientific truth.
And thirdly, though perhaps even more importantly, Peterson is conflating our perception of reality with reality itself, the map for the place, as it were. Peterson is asserting that because our ability to perceive facts and reality is nested in Peterson truth, therefore facts and reality is nested in Peterson truth. Which is akin to me asserting that because you're currently perceiving me in 2 dimensions, I am 2 dimensions. Or to put it another way, Peterson is asserting that because we can only perceive objective facts subjectively, there are no objective facts. But that's not how it works, and it's not what all of the evidence indicates. To quote Harris,
you clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths.
Anyhow, after explaining this to Peterson over 7 times, Harris, in fair frustration, delivered the following elegant bombshell.
Now, the claim about whether or not she's cheating on you is an intelligible claim. That's a claim that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you wind up killing yourself based on your reaction to this unhappy truth. If you then wound up killing yourself, we could say at the end of the day, well, it would be better if he hadn't known that. It would certainly be better if she hadn't done that. It would have been better if he had married a different woman. Surely we would want to say that.
It might be better if he would have paid attention to his damn marriage and to attribute the cause of his demise to the existence of the photographs. This is why I brought up Josh Green, is that investigations into this kind of morality always frame it in such a way that...
Jordan, you have to grant one thing here. There's one piece that doesn't get moved here. You cannot move the piece that because you killed yourself, it's not true that she was having an affair. That move is not open to you, and yet you're acting like it is.
Now, in my opinion, this application of the reductio ad absurdum technique annihilates Peterson's assertion. It's simple. If one was to commit suicide because their partner was cheating on them, the act of suicide wouldn't make their partner's cheating on them untrue in the realist sense. Sure, it would make it untrue in the Peterson sense, but it wouldn't in the realist, period. If a tree falls and nobody hears it, it still makes a sound. It still emits vibrations. Now, with Peterson's definition of truth thoroughly addressed, I want to ask a potent question. Why does Peterson want to nest not only our perception of realist truth, but realist truth itself within Peterson truth? Is it perhaps possible that he has a motive? Well, I'm convinced that he does. You see, this sleight of hand comes in extremely useful to apologists such as Peterson, because when he's asked a question to which he has a justifiable answer, such as, is it true that there are only 2 sexes, he can, and does, answer according to the realist definition of truth. But when he's asked a question to which he doesn't have a justifiable answer, such as, is it true that a literal historical man called Jesus resurrected, he answers according to the Peterson definition of truth, which, considering his animosity for postmodernism, is ironically postmodern. To borrow a phrase from Harris, this is how you play tennis without the net, and it's so disingenuous that I can't help but conclude that Peterson is doing it on purpose, that he's being deliberately obtuse in order to preserve beliefs that he knows damn well are false. Now, if you're not already convinced of this, then perhaps the following clip will change your mind.
Okay, quick question, are you a Christian?
I suppose the most straightforward answer to that is yes, although I think it's let's leave it at yes.
Well, I'm a bit dissatisfied with that because there are so many kinds of Christians, and I would never imagine that you were a very literal-minded Christian.
Well, there are truths other than the literal that perhaps are more truthful than even literal truths. You know, there are many kinds of truth, and I don't mean that in a postmodern way, actually. But the truths that govern behavior and the truths that emerge from facts are not the same truths.
But do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question. And the reason is because, okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed
in a body. And
in a body.
In a body. And,
yes.
And it was a physical body, and that it was on Earth.
Yes. That it was on Earth, and that was literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue, which is a lot different than saying I don't believe that it happened.
You see, once someone corners Peterson by forcing him to answer religious questions according to the realist definition of truth, that is, the definition that he uses in every other domain of discourse, his religious views are exposed for what they are: unjustified nonsense. It seems to me that the reason that Peterson insists on his definition of truth is because it renders everything we confidently know, all facts, all knowledge, as ultimately unknown, because at any moment, however unlikely, they may lead to our demise and thus become untrue in the Peterson sense, and therefore, as he insists, also untrue in the realist sense. To put it bluntly, redefining truth in order to avoid an inconvenient truth is as dishonest as it gets. Intelligent and skeptical people don't accept such utter nonsense from New Age spirituality, and so neither should they accept it from New Age Christianity. Peterson is no doubt a very smart, knowledgeable and insightful person, but when it comes to religion, he's no better than any other apologist. He manipulates language, misrepresents philosophy and science, and is fallacious in his reasoning. This video alone doesn't prove this outright, of course, but it does make a good start, and I'll be sure to follow it up. As always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have donated via PayPal. Your support is what allows me to create videos such as this. Anyhow, I'm going to leave you with another lucid bombshell from Mr. Rationality himself.
It seems to me that a realistic conception of what's going on there, and really the only sane one, if you look long enough at it, is that our language didn't put the energy in the atom. It's not because we spoke a certain way about it that determined the character of physical reality. No, physical reality has a character whether or not there are apes around to talk about it.